So the question is, do DACs and amps actually matter? And if they do matter, how much do they matter? You see these expensive amps and DACs that are $2,000, $3,000, and you think to yourself, how much improvement is that really going to give me? Is it going to make the sound better? And on top of that, a lot of folks are also confused about how reviewers feel about this, in particular us. We haven't really addressed this topic all that much in video form, but we have talked about it at length in live streams. So I figured we would just talk about it here as well. So I've brought with me Cameron, Griffin, and Caleb to talk about this topic. Without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so let's just open the floor to talk about like what everybody feels generally about amps and DACs, whether or not they matter, and how much people should actually care about them. Let's start with Caleb. How do you feel about amps and DACs? Do you care? Is this something people should care about?
Yeah, I mean, I would consider myself source agnostic in the sense that I'm not fully on the side that it's like it's never going to make a difference, but I'm also like, I don't really care that much to delve into it. If I go to a meet and I'm trying somebody's like $10,000 amp and I think it makes a difference, I'm like, great, that's awesome. I don't have $10,000, so it's a nice thing to play around with, but I'm not gonna go hardcore into it. Where I do think it really does matter though is that I think there are like objectively three reasons why you should have at least a good DAC amp to begin with, and that is noise, output impedance, and power. That's kind of like the baseline for me.
I think for me, the issue with all of this is you have sources out there that are fairly inexpensive where they're essentially below any potential threshold for noise and distortion, where any of that stuff would be even audible. And in fact, most headphones coming out these days don't typically even need all that much power. In many instances, it's almost like there's no point to having a standalone desktop amplifier setup. But I also don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that there is never going to be any difference or that it's completely imperceptible, because I think there's things that people aren't properly identifying in the measurements that they're doing, and B, I think there is a possibility of certain things like output impedance, having a pretty big impact. In fact, I would say most of the time when people are perceiving differences for DACs and amps and things like that, it has to do with level matching issues, so not level matching, and so it's actually just an SPL difference, or it's an output impedance relationship with certain headphones. And that's where you're going to notice these differences. And this has then created the idea that, it has a sound. But that's my perspective on it. I'll throw it over to Cameron now. What do you think?
A big part of the reason why I'm interested in DACs and amps isn't because I think they make a massive change. They make a hell of a lot less difference than just the headphones themselves. You should be focusing on your speakers and your headphones because that is going to make vastly more difference. But I also think that some of the improvements and changes you can get with DACs, for instance, are things which the headphones themselves don't change. I mean, headphones, for example, aren't going to change jitter. I find that DACs influence the sort of spatial perception of things more so, or in a different way than the headphones themselves do, independent of frequency response. So I think that's the bit where we'd probably disagree.
I have a question for you, Cameron. For folks who are of the opinion that once it's past a certain threshold for noise and distortion, there's no reason to care. To the idea that, a certain DAC or a certain amp is going to have a sound beyond, psychoacoustic effects and things like that. What are folks on that side of the fence missing?
I think there's a few potential things. I mean, the first thing is, what is that threshold? People say, but it measures transparent, when actually we don't necessarily know where the limits of audible transparency are. Even just things like high-res audio, never mind the performance of the product itself, is high-resolution audio audible, and there is some study into that which suggests that, at least for some people, yes, it is. And interestingly, the ability to discern it got better with practice, which is kind of interesting as well. There's a lot of things, even just distortion, like trying to find clear answers as to what level of total harmonic distortion is actually audible or inaudible, what counts as transparent. The more you look into it, the more you realize we don't actually have a good answer. And then how will that answer change if you're looking at higher order components instead of just second order stuff, for example? I don't have a strong opinion on the idea of where audible transparency is. My opinion is just that if you're proclaiming that there is a threshold of audible transparency without either defining it, or if you are defining it without evidence, that's incorrect to do.
So I guess to bring this back to that original question, then say there's somebody who has, like a basic amplifier and DAC setup for the majority of the headphones that they have. Is there, Cameron, in your opinion, a reason for them to consider some of these more expensive products? How is a person supposed to determine what good is when we're dealing with things like, potentially almost imperceptible harmonic distortion, and in some cases imperceptible harmonic distortion differences, and if that is leading to a difference in sound, how is a person supposed to really figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I think it's one which is not necessarily just related to source gear stuff. It's the same with headphones. People are going to be influenced by price. That is always going to be a problem, whether it's headphones, speakers, complete snake oil products, or DACs, amps, whatever. And I don't really know what the solution to that is. I personally do quite a lot of blind A/B testing, and it's something which I would encourage more people to do, because I do think that people get influenced and end up with conclusions that aren't necessarily based in reality, especially if they do know how much something costs ahead of time. There are also things like when people are comparing products, volume matching and stuff is incredibly important, and a lot of people don't do that properly. A being especially when you have such minute differences, and they really are minute differences a hell of a lot of the time, if they're competent products anyway, it is very difficult. Part of my answer would be that for a lot of people, you maybe shouldn't care. And I would reiterate the point that you should be spending your money on and focusing on your headphones, or if you're talking about speakers, your speakers and your room as well, far before you spend any kind of meaningful money on your DACs and amps. The JDS Element 4 is a product which I recommend to a lot of people because it is a good DAC, it is a good amp, subjectively to me and objectively as well. It's got built-in EQ, it's got more than enough power for just about everything. There isn't much of a reason to go any further beyond that until you have got everything else sorted. The idea that you should be spending a similar amount of money on your DACs and amps to your headphones is not a good plan, in my opinion. I don't think there's a real easy answer other than to accept the fact that placebo and expectation bias are very powerful factors to which none of us are immune. And if you aren't doing blind testing, you are going to be influenced by those, and it is going to impact your perception, no matter how talented you are, no matter how good your hearing is, no matter how much money you have or how clever you are. It's just a problem. But then the same thing goes for headphones as well, or speakers. And so I think that's just general advice, really, when you're talking about stuff in audio.
I'm glad you brought up the blind testing and blind listening stuff, because my position on this has changed as a result of having done that. And that's why I sort of attribute a lot of the reported differences online for various different amps and DACs and stuff to SPL differences. After having done, various different blind A/B tests with different source equipment, I realized that even if there were moments where I thought maybe I could hear a difference between two pieces of equipment, A, I wouldn't get that answer consistently right, like right enough times for it to really matter. And B, I never felt that I cared. I never once did I feel like this was something that would meaningfully change my opinion of the headphone that I was using with whatever it was, right? And we could say, yeah, a lot of this is going to change depending on, different headphones. Maybe a different pair of headphones needs more power and that sort of thing. Or there's another headphone that's going to react differently depending on output impedance. But then my position is, well, that's an output impedance relationship, or it's a power requirement issue. It's not to do with any sort of magical properties inherent to the amp or the DAC or the device. These are all things that are understandable with measurements, with data. And we can create those relationships in different ways, right? We can create an output impedance relationship with an impedance adapter. The thing where it actually does start to matter a little bit to me is maybe when we're talking about things like harmonic distortion profiles, because as you say, Cameron, it's not clear where those thresholds are for people. And it's not like there's a blanket, like, this is the threshold for human discernibility of harmonic distortion products. It's probably going to be different on an individual basis.
I mean, like, you can do the Clipel's got like a listening test thing you can do online, and I mean, you can see the bell curve of results from that, and obviously that's going to differ based on practice, what gear you're using and stuff. And I know a couple other people have managed to get down to the very bottom of it, which is I think minus 77 dB. So at least there, presumably you could go further. But to answer the second part of your earlier question, there are other things which people should be paying attention to. Actually, if you're watching this, go and watch the Myths About Measurements video, because part of the problem is that people tend to just look at 1 kilohertz SINAD. And there are a lot of products which that just does not tell the whole story, because products don't behave consistently. They change depending on what they're doing. For amplifiers in particular, one thing that I stress again and again that people should be paying attention to isn't what is the distortion of that amp or how much power can it output. It is how is the distortion changing as the power output increases. There are a lot of products which either have quite significant rising distortion past a fraction of a watt, even if they can do 10 watts output. And so it's going to change in sound and potentially be more colored if you're driving difficult to drive headphones on it, for instance. But then there are also other products which are extremely consistent right up until you just hit their max output. But then there's other things like, what if you tested at 5 kilohertz? Or what if you test at 100 hertz? The big point I'd make there is that there are a lot of things that people aren't paying attention to. And in some cases, people aren't even measuring. This is one of the reasons why I try and have my measurements be as thorough as possible, because I guess what I'd say is I have never heard two devices that sounded different but didn't measure different. There are plenty of situations where they might look almost identical or be basically identical for that 1 kilohertz SINAD measurement, but then they sound different. But then there are all sorts of potential things which could explain why that is when you look at all of the other measurements and how that device or those devices are behaving when they're not just playing 1 kilohertz.
Given that Cameron has just made a fairly compelling case to care about this kind of stuff, let's move over to Griffin and see what he thinks.
I think people who know me may be surprised to know that early on in my time in this hobby, I went down the source rabbit hole, spent money, tested stuff, felt I heard differences and, made purchase decisions based on that. I think it's not only an issue of audiophiles hearing something and whether that something be real or not, they feel they hear something, and that not necessarily being tied to the objective reality. We are not perceiving objective reality, so if we perceive something, especially something like a sound difference through amplifiers or DACs, it takes a lot to confirm that that is objectively happening, and frankly, most of the time, you see people, coming up with impressions of DACs and amps. They're not also measuring the devices to verify that there is a difference that they should be hearing that confirms, what they're hearing is true. But also, I feel like this comes down to something that I feel like the DAC amp measurement, because some of them do measure differently, doesn't really account for, which is that even if these minute differences in distortion profile or crosstalk or whatever occur between two devices, I basically do not buy that audiophiles or really any listeners could consistently discern a preference between two of them unless one of them is like dramatically different. But that's basically never been the case in this sphere with most competent products. What I see most often is people comparing either two competent pieces of gear and it being pretty hard to tell a difference even in a cited test to incompetent pieces of gear, like things that have measured roll-off or distortion that should cross the audible threshold, taking that as a sign that, oh, these things make a difference. But in both cases, I don't really think either side is doing enough due diligence to say their side of the argument that I think they're trying to prove is proven. But furthermore, if I'm the person that's making music and I were to pan the guitar on the right side just a little bit farther to the center instead of farther to the right, which would basically be akin to a crosstalk difference, that's not going to affect anybody's preference. If I were to, turn the distortion up on the snare drum 0.2%, that's not going to affect anybody's preference. If I were to make a small decibel change between 10 to 20 kilohertz, that's not going to affect anyone's preference. So realistically, I think the flaw in all of this, all of the differences that people can hear between these devices, competently designed or not, I'm not sure they're big enough to really influence preference consistently across listeners, considering how wide we know the preference window for an individual listener actually is. I want to give one take in support of the people who want to buy, DACs and amps and source gear, though, because while, yes, I've held this kind of position for a while now, the more I listen to headphones, the more I wish I had something nice on my desk to plug into to kind of be intentional with my listening time. I've brought it up on the live stream a bunch of times, but I do wish I owned a Woo Audio WA7 Fireflies, just because I think it would look amazing. I think it would be a really nice kind of ritualistic aspect of the thing I enjoy most, which is listening to music. Having this other thing, whether it objectively helps or not, makes me feel like I'm having more fun listening to music because it's very simple on the face of it. It's just a plug and a knob, but it has that glow to it with the tubes and the lights. I feel like that's something that is underexplored when it comes to the discussion around sources. Some of them look so fucking cool. That alone is, I think, maybe valid for people to justify, spending a lot of money on one that they feel looks cooler.
And it's also likely responsible for, the intentional listening bit that you just mentioned. That's responsible, I imagine, for a lot of the reports about, whatever the differences are. Because again, they're also not being, level matched between two devices, and they're not blind. In reality, the sighted listening is the thing that actually does matter when it comes to the experience, because as you just put it, there's intentional listening that's going into that. It's a little bit like borrowing that ritualistic aspect of vinyl and applying that to this whole space, right? And that is something that like I think is genuinely worthwhile, right? Like having a reason to sit down and give a shit about the music that you're listening to and engage with it, rather than just being like, I'm going to push play on Spotify. I want to bring this back to Caleb. I don't get into the DAP world at all, or like the portable device or anything like that. Is there anything in that world where you've definitely experienced a difference where you're like, that really matters?
That's a hard question to answer. I'd say my stance on that is kind of the same like what I said at the start. I'm source agnostic. But I'll give an example, actually. It is actually a cited A/B test. So when I reviewed the Storm a while ago, I compared my FiO Q7, which is not really a DAP, but it's, it's a very portable amplifier, and the Firm Urtso, which is like a $3,000 amp that I use at home for most of my reviews and just general listening, right? Once again, there's a cited comparison, but I knew that the Storm was made with sort of the FiO Q7 in mind as part of its development. And when I was comparing them, I did think there was a difference between those two devices, even in a cited comparison. But the one that won was actually the Q7, not the $3,000 more expensive, very fancy, very beautiful Firm Urtso, right? But for me, it was a very subtle difference, and I don't care enough about the difference to be like, yeah, I have to use the Storm with the Q7, but I still felt it, right? I guess I would say two things that are maybe a little unscientific. I think almost anything can happen in principle. Like I try not to write anything off, and I would also say it's a question of to what extent does it matter. Maybe you are someone who can listen down to negative 77 decibels, right? But to what extent do you put importance on that, right? And I think that's something an individual has to sort of figure out for themselves. The other thing on the flip side, I would say, is that there's people that argue like, well, people can't hear above 20 kilohertz or whatever, right? And so there's no point. I would say, there's people out there who can echolocate with their voice, right? I feel like humans, like perceptions, can go to so many different levels that are unexplored. And, who's to say that your experience must be wrong because the established science says that, you're wrong.
I'm not sure about echolocation, but the point you raise is one where we've demonstrated, cases where an individual's hearing is outside of the typically defined 20 to 20 kilohertz, right? And that's Cameron. And that was a source of great confusion for a particular, yeah.
Well, that's the thing. The 20 kilohertz thing isn't even like a hard rule, though. It's a roughly
but that's the
round
point.
number.
My point is not that, you can or cannot hear it. My point is that I think that over time, some people could develop, a very specialized, personal, highly subjective like skill set and hear music in a way that other people don't necessarily do. And so their experience is so unique to them that they put value in expensive gear, right? And the more I hang out with people at like hand jams and even my friends locally who do have very, very expensive gear and I play around with theirs, that's something I've started to notice where my experience as a reviewer is completely different from what they value as real, really deep into the hobby, right? They have entire rooms just set up just for listening, and I'm here just, at a desk.
I've got some gear which for most people would be stupid, and then there are various other products, including some which I have heard, which are better than things I have, which I could just never justify because it's just too much money. A McLaren is a better car than a Ford Fiesta, and for some people that makes a lot of sense. I can't afford one, so it doesn't matter. I can still appreciate it. And the engineering is another side. The one thing that I do get annoyed about with high-end source gear stuff is that there is a lot of stuff which is expensive purely for the sake of being expensive. And then people will rave about it because it's expensive, so it must be better, right? And given the inconsequential differences we do see, placebo and all the problems do lend towards people giving it better feedback, even if it's worse. But then there are genuinely a lot of things where it's like, okay, this is really expensive, and it's in many cases likely that this stuff is just making either no improvement or the tiniest potential in some situations improvement, but you can still see and appreciate all that's gone into it.
I think my issue with all of that, though, is not so much that those products exist, but rather that the conversation around this topic, right? Audiophile chains and whatever, you rarely see people fixing the problems with their headphones first.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
In those conversations, in those circles, you often see people shifting the goalposts instead to, well, you got to try this headphone with this whatever expensive amp and DAC. And I guess I would have much less problem with that side of things if the messaging around it was fix the problem with headphones first, right? Get into EQ, personalize the sound to your heart's content, get it to actually sound good first, and then enjoy whatever intentional listening thing you're trying to do. Or if there are genuinely perceptible differences, say for tube amps, and it's another good example, then bother to enjoy that stuff, right? I have a hard time with this idea that like the headphone's true potential is going to be unlocked by leveling up to a particular piece of source equipment, when really the unlocking of its potential is to do with things like EQ.
Ideally, the unlocking of the potential would happen before the headphone leaves the factory. Like, I feel like
exactly.
like this discussion that you're talking about, where source or DAC or amp enjoyer is saying that the headphone sounds better than, for example, Resolve thinks it does when paired with a particular piece of gear. I feel like there's a lack of two types of acknowledgement. One, an acknowledgement that some headphones just aren't going to work for people. And two, an acknowledgement that most headphones just aren't perfect. And a lot of headphones aren't even great. When it comes to this discussion about fixing a headphone, whether it's with EQ or with a DAC or whatever, I can't help but feel like the downside, the price that we pay for the DAC amp discussion being validated, is that it does kind of give license to these same people to be a little bit more content with less good headphones.
It's less to do with the fact that these, let me know what you think, but if you were to take a headphone that, say you could apply whatever EQ, to your heart's content, do that EQ for somebody, right? And then run that headphone, even if it's a good headphone, just off of any source that they could possibly want, right? Is anybody confused about which one would be more preferred? In my mind, people are confused about that. And that shouldn't be confusing, right? It should be obvious that if you fix the headphone, it will sound better, regardless of the thing that you plug it into.
I definitely agree with that. I think that there are a couple, and I mean a couple, edge cases where there are genuine concerns about how, like, the tungsten. The tungsten is a headphone where if I run it on my HM1, which is my regular amp and stuff, I can very easily get the bass to clip. And if you're running it on most amps that output 10 volts, you are genuinely likely not running it to its full potential. And it's not super obvious depending on how your amp clips, particularly in low frequency stuff. But that is a real edge case. And it's not a case of, oh, well, you need to go and buy a 10 grand amp. It's, no, you just need to buy something which can do a little bit more voltage output, and there's some cheap options for that too. I think the real problem with the EQ side of things is just that learning to EQ proper, because auto EQ sucks, and learning to EQ is hard. Like, learning to EQ properly to actually get something sounding stellar is not a particularly simple process, and does require a fair bit of learning and experimenting and time. And people don't necessarily want to do that, especially when you end up with a lot of bad results before you kind of work out how to do it properly. Whereas just buying a nicer thing and plugging it in is something which, especially if then you've got forums full of people telling you that you're doing the right thing, it's a easier option. And so I think it's no surprise that a lot of people end up doing that. But yeah, I mean, like, for me, one of my favorite pieces of source gear, and if I had to slim down my chain to DAC, amp, headphone, whatever, the one thing that I would absolutely make sure is still in there is my Zale EQ1. That's like probably the most critical piece of equipment in my chain at the moment.
I think that's, again, a situation where I would be more comfortable with the conversations around these devices if people are also willing to, acknowledge the benefits of EQ, or the idea of headphones should just be tuned better, like what Griffin suggested earlier. That's kind of where
they
where
shouldn't
I'm at
have
with it,
ridiculous power requirements.
Yeah, exactly. Be designed in such a way where, like, this part of it, this whole concept of synergy stops making sense, because in my mind it stopped making sense a long time ago, apart from the edge cases.
I do have one thing to mention which I think hasn't been talked about yet, which is that a lot of this discussion of, like, does it even matter much, actually realistically only something that we can kind of talk about in the last, I don't know, a little over 5 years. Like, going back 10 years ago or longer than that, I think it's much more the case that sources absolutely did make a difference, because so many of them were objectively colored and bad in various different ways, and so it was a case of pick your color. Nowadays we are really fortunate that at all sorts of prices you can get genuinely fantastic DACs and amps and whatever. That's actually a relatively new thing. Like, going back in time, a lot of stuff did sound different because they were very different, whereas now generally speaking stuff does perform a lot better. So part of it's just that things have improved a lot. Well, regardless of any of this discussion, though, if you do want to buy DACs and amps, the place to do it is headphones.com, because they have a 365-day return policy. So if you buy something and you think, you know what, actually, that didn't make as much difference as I wanted it to, you can just send it back and not need to worry about it. It also makes everything that we do on this channel possible. They support all of us and are the reason that we're able to do this. So for your next audio purchase, consider headphones.com. They allow us to be honest, which is something we all appreciate a lot.
So what do you guys think? Let us know down in the comments below. Do DACs and amps make a difference? How much do they matter? Do you disagree with us here? If you do, let us know. You can chat with us at the headphones.com forum or our Discord, also linked below. Until next time, we'll see you guys later. Bye for now.